Imagine waking up in 2025 and realizing that the operating system that dominated American computers for decades is no longer the automatic choice. For years, Windows was the default. Schools used it, government offices relied on it, corporations built their entire digital infrastructure around it. If you walked into an office anywhere in the United States, chances were overwhelming that the computer in front of you was running Windows. But something has changed, and the shift is happening faster than most people expected. Across the country, from small businesses to state departments, from tech startups to cybersecurity teams, Linux is no longer the alternative. It is becoming the strategic decision. At first glance, the idea sounds unbelievable. Windows has ruled the desktop world for nearly 40 years. It survived the rise of the internet, the explosion of smartphones, and the growth of cloud computing. It adapted to security crises, browser wars, and hardware revolutions. Yet in 2025, the conversation has shifted from whether Linux can compete to why so many Americans are actively choosing it over Windows. The numbers behind this trend are surprising. Linux desktop usage in the United States has climbed past levels that experts once thought would take another decade to reach. While Windows still holds a majority, its share has been steadily shrinking year after year. What once looked like statistical noise has turned into measurable migration. One of the biggest catalysts behind this movement is the end-of-life deadline for Windows 10. When Microsoft announced that support for Windows 10 would officially end, millions of Americans suddenly faced a dilemma. Their computers still worked perfectly, their hardware was reliable, their performance was acceptable. But without security updates, continuing to use the system would become risky. The obvious solution seemed simple. Upgrade to Windows 11. That's where the shock began. A massive percentage of existing PCs did not meet Windows 11's strict hardware requirements. Requirements like TPM 2.0 and specific processor generations instantly disqualified millions of machines that were otherwise functioning without issue. For home users, that meant a painful choice: buy a new computer or find another operating system. For businesses and public institutions, the problem multiplied. Replacing thousands of computers at once is not just expensive, it's logistically overwhelming. Budgets stretched thin by inflation and cybersecurity demands suddenly had to account for hardware refresh cycles that were never planned. This is where Linux entered the conversation in a serious way. Instead of discarding perfectly usable hardware, organizations began testing Linux distributions on their existing machines. The results surprised them. Systems that struggled under newer Windows updates suddenly felt fast and responsive again. Performance is one of the quiet advantages driving this transition. Linux distributions are often lighter, more efficient, and less resource-hungry than modern Windows builds. Without the heavy background telemetry services, bundled applications, and forced updates that characterize recent Windows versions, Linux can breathe new life into older systems. For institutions managing hundreds or thousands of endpoints, this efficiency translates directly into cost savings. Every machine that doesn't need replacement is money preserved for other priorities. But cost is only one part of the equation. Security has become perhaps the most powerful motivator behind the shift. The United States faces an unprecedented level of cyber threats. Government agencies, healthcare systems, educational institutions, and private corporations are constant targets of ransomware and data breaches. In this climate, control over software becomes more than a technical issue. It becomes a national security concern. Linux offers something unique in this regard: transparency. Because it is open source, its code can be inspected, audited, and modified. Organizations are not entirely dependent on a single corporation to patch vulnerabilities or disclose issues. This flexibility appeals strongly to cybersecurity teams looking to minimize risk. Another factor that cannot be ignored is privacy. Over the past decade, users have grown increasingly aware of data collection practices embedded in modern operating systems. Windows 11 introduced deeper integration with cloud services, advertising identifiers, and telemetry systems that many users find intrusive. While Microsoft provides controls to manage these features, the perception of reduced user control has persisted. Linux, by contrast, is built on a philosophy of user autonomy. There are no forced advertisements in the Start menu. There are no mandatory online accounts required for installation in most distributions. The user decides what to install, what to remove, and what to share. Corporate America is also rethinking its dependency on proprietary ecosystems. Cloud computing has fundamentally changed how software is deployed. Many enterprise applications now run inside browsers or virtualized environments. If your primary workflow exists in a web application, the underlying desktop operating system becomes less critical. In this environment, Linux becomes not just viable, but attractive. It integrates seamlessly with cloud-native tools, development environments, and container platforms. Developers in particular have long preferred Linux-based systems for programming, automation, and server management. As development teams influence corporate purchasing decisions, Linux adoption grows organically. Education is another sector experiencing quiet transformation. School districts across the United States face budget constraints and aging hardware inventories. Chromebooks introduced many students to Linux-based systems indirectly, even if they didn't realize it. As administrators evaluate alternatives to costly Windows upgrades, Linux desktops become part of the discussion. In computer science departments and technical training programs, Linux is often the default teaching platform. Students graduating into the workforce are more comfortable with it than previous generations were. Cultural familiarity reduces resistance. Small businesses are also contributing to the momentum. For a small company operating on thin margins, software licensing fees add up quickly. When business owners discover that they can deploy Linux on office machines without recurring operating system licensing costs, the financial logic becomes compelling. Open-source office suites, accounting tools, and productivity software have matured significantly. What once required Windows-specific applications can now be accomplished through cross-platform or web-based solutions. Gaming, once considered Linux's greatest weakness, has improved dramatically. Compatibility layers and game distribution platforms have expanded support for Linux users. While Windows still dominates gaming overall, the barrier that once kept gamers from even considering Linux has weakened. For technically inclined users, dual booting or fully switching is no longer unthinkable. Every niche that becomes accessible widens the overall adoption base. Perhaps the most shocking statistic of all is not simply the percentage increase in Linux desktop share, but the migration intent surveys conducted among IT professionals. A growing percentage report actively testing or planning Linux deployments within their organizations. That shift in mindset signals something deeper than temporary frustration with Windows 11. It suggests strategic reconsideration. When decision-makers begin asking whether Windows is necessary at all, the monopoly mindset dissolves. Government procurement policies are also evolving. There is growing interest in open standards, interoperability, and reducing vendor lock-in. By diversifying operating systems and encouraging open-source adoption, agencies can avoid over-reliance on any single corporation. This diversification is not about hostility toward Microsoft, it is about resilience. A heterogeneous environment can sometimes be more secure and adaptable than a uniform one. Critics argue that Linux still faces usability hurdles. Certain specialized software packages remain Windows exclusive. Some enterprise workflows depend on legacy applications built decades ago. These challenges are real, and they prevent a complete overnight transformation. However, virtualization, compatibility layers, and remote desktop solutions increasingly mitigate these limitations. Organizations do not have to abandon Windows entirely to benefit from Linux. Hybrid environments allow gradual transitions. Younger technology professionals grew up in a world shaped by open-source collaboration. Platforms like GitHub normalize the idea that software can be built collectively and shared freely. This mindset contrasts sharply with the proprietary dominance of the 1990s and early 2000s. As this generation moves into leadership roles, their comfort with Linux influences institutional decisions. The narrative that the United States is abandoning Windows may sound dramatic, but it captures an important psychological shift. For decades, Windows was assumed. It was the unquestioned baseline. Now, it is one option among many. The erosion of inevitability is powerful. When millions of users realize they have alternatives that are stable, secure, and cost-effective, loyalty becomes conditional rather than automatic. Economic pressures amplify this reconsideration. Inflation, supply chain constraints, and budget scrutiny force organizations to justify every major expenditure. If upgrading to Windows 11 requires both new licenses and new hardware, the total cost of ownership rises sharply. Linux, often free and hardware flexible, presents a stark contrast. Even if migration requires training and adaptation, the long-term savings can outweigh short-term friction. There is also symbolism involved. Linux represents independence from centralized corporate control. In a time when debates about digital sovereignty, antitrust regulation, and technological self-determination dominate headlines, open-source software aligns with broader cultural currents. Choosing Linux can feel like aligning with a philosophy as much as a platform. Despite all this momentum, it is important to remain realistic. Windows is not disappearing in 2025. It remains deeply embedded in enterprise, environments, and consumer markets alike. However, the direction of change is unmistakable. Growth rates tell a story of increasing acceptance. The conversation has shifted from whether Linux can survive on the desktop to how far it can expand. For viewers watching this transformation unfold, the takeaway is clear. The operating system landscape in the United States is no longer static. Windows may still hold the majority, but its dominance is no longer unchallenged. Linux has moved from the periphery to the mainstream conversation, fueled by hardware restrictions, cost concerns, security priorities, and a desire for user control. Americans are reconsidering long-standing assumptions. The shocking stats are not just about percentages. They are about momentum. They are about millions of downloads, thousands of institutional pilots, and a growing cultural acceptance that alternatives exist. In 2025, the idea that Windows is required for modern computing no longer holds the same weight it once did, and as more individuals and organizations discover that their workflows function smoothly on Linux, the migration accelerates quietly, steadily, and perhaps irreversibly. This is not merely a technical trend. It is a reflection of broader shifts in economics, security, and digital philosophy. Whether the United States ultimately reaches double-digit Linux desktop share or not, one thing is certain. The era of unquestioned Windows dominance is fading. The operating system wars are no longer about flashy advertisements or retail box sales. They are about infrastructure, sustainability, and control. As 2025 continues, more stories will emerge of companies replacing aging Windows fleets with Linux deployments, of government departments experimenting with open-source desktops, and of everyday users discovering that their old laptop runs better than ever with a different system installed. Each of these stories adds another data point to a larger narrative. The question is no longer if Linux can compete. The question is how far this shift will go. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes 2025 such a pivotal year in American computing history.